Good morning, Brandon. How are you?
Doing well, Martin. Good morning. How are you?
Very well, very well. Good to connect. Good to have you on our program.
Likewise.
Well, look, for the benefit of the audience, we always like to start with a bit of an intro on yourself, your background, how you got into the value space, and yeah, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, so I took a more, I would like to say, unorthodox avenue into the value space. So I know historically you'll have a lot of value engineers with a consulting background. So that wasn't necessarily me. So, I say I got a little bit of luck getting into this space during my kind of timed it up in a nice way. So I'd spent like majority of my career in the finance and investment world. So I worked in operations, trading, investments, sort of different roles across different companies. And during 2020, when there was more of a boom with software companies. They were hiring a lot aggressively. I found this role with Smartsheet where they were looking for value strategists. So obviously I had some skill set in regards to like the value modeling, those sort of things, but I'd never been a consultant by nature. And so, obviously was very grateful that Smartsheet took a chance on me. I was obviously very confident I could do the role, but was very grateful. And that's where I say it's a little bit of a luck kind of getting into that
Sure.
sort of avenue. And so worked at Smartsheet for about 3.5 years, did a lot of cool work over there, helped scale and build that practice because when I got brought in, it was a rather new function. So I got to really see, how that works, the challenges, how you think about scaling. And then I made a transition over to Zoom Info where I was essentially the value practice, which was very challenging and exciting at the same time. And then more recently, I'm now over here at Poly AI where I am the senior value consultant, where same concept, obviously smaller companies. So I'll be taking over the value practice now.
Exciting. And we'll get to that in a second. But you mentioned something about a slightly unorthodox background to get into it. It's really interesting because we've obviously done quite a lot of these podcasts or fireside chats over the course of last year. And it's true, like there's this universal Venn diagram where business value consulting is in the middle. And then you've
Mhm.
got the different routes to get in there. You've got the traditional consulting route, the McKinseys, the Accentures, and those. Then you've got the value selling universe, so the BMCs of the world, SAPs, those that kind of with they cut their teeth directly in sales and expand it out. And then you've got individuals who have come from some sort of a finance background who obviously get the financial numbers, but have gotten the itch to go into the value side. And that seems to be a little bit about where how you come into it.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, at this time, growing up, I've always been very intentional about like what I want to do in my career. And I always try to anchor on like, what are my skill sets? What do I enjoy? And there's two things that really stuck out to me, throughout my career. It's, I'm very analytical by nature. So obviously investments, finance, value modeling, those sort of things come natural to me because I enjoy them. And then I love, connecting with people and building relationships. And so that's a lot of what you do in value selling. Obviously, you got to be able to build trust, relationships, get buy-in. And so, when I was looking to make a jump out of the finance world, I wanted to be with a company and, an industry that was really growing, and SaaS obviously was really growing and hot in 2020, and wanted to really get into a role that fit those two things. And that's
Yeah.
exactly what value engineering is. It's, you get to build relationships, you get to still have that analytical side. And so it really fit exactly what I was looking for. And, obviously the SaaS world is booming, and obviously there's a lot of competition, but there's a lot of opportunity as well.
It's also a space that, as you know, we're in this complete paradigm shift of digital technologies thanks to AI, agents,
Yep.
the whole thing. And even we, from a Simbi perspective, are seeing a huge growth in our customer base in of companies that are AI native, that know the benefit that they can provide, but struggle to really translate that benefit into economic drivers, financial drivers, or value drivers. And so, like we talked about a little bit, the evolution. We'll get into that in a moment. But it's interesting how it is becoming much more of a necessary activity or practice in organizations. And I guess maybe that's why you've joined Poly AI, right? Because it feels like it's in that space.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, AI is like that big buzzword that everyone's saying nowadays. It's everywhere. Every customer you talk to, that's even before I was at Poly A, a lot of customers be like, "What AI features do you guys have?" And they
It's
want,
.com
yeah,
25 years ago, basically.
yeah, exactly. So, this was definitely very appealing to me to jump into that sort of company who is focused, primarily on the AI agents. And, it's really exciting because there is good value props with, AI. Obviously, you got to be really good in defining what your AI does and have those value differentiators that are going to resonate with a customer specific to maybe their industry or vertical. So yeah, 100%, like just AI is booming, obviously. And I found, a great opportunity here to really be a part of that.
It's also a category that's driving a big shift in pricing structure changes, right? The whole by seat. I wouldn't say the seat-based pricing is dead, because that would be a very, very generic statement, but there is a lot of pressure on organizations to consider more creative kinds of pricing. And I would imagine that value has a role to play in really helping the pricing people or people in charge of pricing in organizations figure out what are the right levers.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, being a part of three different companies now, obviously newer here to Poly, but the last two companies are at, you always have those conversations like, well, how do we price in AI? Do we let them bring their own AI? Like that sort of conversation, like how do we price this out? And I think there's always been an idea around consumption based, right? Like usage and those sort of things. And I think in my perspective, maybe it's going down that route of more of like a consumption based, depending on what your AI does and really charging that way. But I think it's going to continue to evolve as we understand this AI a lot better. But yeah, I think consumption based, in my opinion, is where a lot of these companies have focused in on.
We're seeing that companies like Databricks, they're consumption based. I think
Yep.
obviously it needs to align with your product delivery model. But what's interesting that I've found, at least from at least exploring alternative pricing options, be it consumption based, outcome based, adoption based, is that they sound really strong and they're a very confident way to go to market, because you can only do that if you're confident in the delivery of your product. But I've sometimes found that buyers aren't ready for a variable type pricing, where buyers, specifically CFOs, they want to know what they're going to be spending on.
Yeah.
And so there's a bit of, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever found some friction there in kind of modeling something a little bit more creative in pricing, thinking that it's actually going to be to the benefit of the buyer, but in fact they just want something quite simple?
That's such a, and I totally understand, like, with CFOs and them thinking like, well, if I'm buying a bucket of minutes or whatever and usage and I'm going to be charged for that, it's like you want to make sure you get that exact usage down when you're building out that proposal and like what they're actually going to use versus maybe not use. And I think thinking about the value component as well as like making sure they understand exactly what they're going to get. Obviously doing a really good job in discovery when you're scoping it out around where you believe the usage will be. And I always am in the mindset of, try to be more conservative. I think the worst conversation you can have when you get towards renewal is like they didn't use enough. And like you charge them for more than what they use.
Oof.
I think you'd rather be on the other end of like, hey, let's be conservative and maybe they use more, which is fine. I think that's an easier conversation to have. Like, how do we work those numbers out rather than being like, hey, I didn't use 50% of what you said I was going to use. That's a really tough conversation, even if you do have value.
That's a really good idea, actually, almost to under undercut yourself year one, prove
Yep.
out your value, and then you can expand, because that it can only tell a very compelling positive story. It's a bit of a gamble year one, but I think it can pay off. That's a good idea.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think the because to me it's if they're not using it and they're underutilized, like that's a really tough conversation, regardless
Yeah.
of value. Like they're just going to be pushing back a ton, and then you're going to have to maybe reduce some of the ARR, that sort of thing. So it's better to be like, hey, you're using it, you're getting great value. Let's work on the numbers, and that's a much easier conversation.
And that kind of leads into the whole theme of value realization, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of the whole industry, and further to your point in the evolution, it clearly has started in the sales side, because that's your entry through the door. But value realization in an environment where renewals aren't guaranteed anymore, there's a lot more scrutiny on spend, scrutiny on value, scrutiny also on multiple solutions, and trying to consolidate. How have you seen the evolution in value moving towards realization? Or yeah.
Yeah, I think historically in my experiences I've got into this space, value realization wasn't as big of a focus, for whatever reason. I think it kind of took a backseat to business cases. Like business cases were what, value engineering teams worked on. Obviously, what value potential can the customer get? But the value realization wasn't really, in my opinion,
Yeah.
utilized. And there was no great handoff from like business case to CSM to then take and remeasure 6 to 12 months down the road. But what we're seeing now is that's almost becoming a more important piece. Is like, what value am I getting? And so I think having good handoffs from like business cases to CSMs to remeasure, they know exactly what to look at. They have the benchmark data they can use. Because one of my stops over at Zoom Info, we really focused on value realization. Like that was a very, very big focus. And we really had to justify the current spend. And I think that's going to become more prominent, as you said, like as companies are looking to reduce their tech spend, like every company's looking at where they can cut. And the first conversation they want to have is like, what value are we getting? And I think that's something that you got to get ahead of, like months down the road,
Exactly.
and not necessarily, hey, we got a month before the renewal. Let's try to get this thing put
Totally.
together.
That's the only way to do it. Hope for the
Yeah.
best.
Yeah.
And it kind of like leads me to think there's actually four whys, right? There's this, why us, why now, why again, right? And that's value realization, and that is critical, and we're seeing more and more of that. We talk a lot about it because our product has that continuity from the business case into value realization. It's so important that handover is done not just appropriately, but also connects the original business case to the tracking of value being delivered. And
Yeah. And I
yeah,
think even one more point, Mark, because you make a good point there, is you're seeing it more with value management software, right? Like yourselves, like the value realization sort of component wasn't built into some of these softwares. It was more of like, hey, build a business case and that's it.
yeah,
Now, talking with some of the people across the value management software space, that's a feature now that's being incorporated more and more. And I think that's
absolutely.
super instrumental because, we're seeing such a bigger need on that side of the house of like being able to justify that spend.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And at the end of the day, we always talk about this, but the business case, it's still hypothetical. All
Yep.
the entire time, it's your best guess as a buyer and a seller on the value that can be created for the buyer. But until the rubber meets the road, until you actually start to provide your services, you don't know. And that's why value delivery or value realization is so key. And how are you building that into your value practice, either in your prior roles or in the one that you're doing now? Whatever you're able to share, of course.
Yeah, so obviously super new to Poly AI, so haven't got my full hands around that quite yet.
Sure.
But historically, over at my previous stops, so at Zoom Info, it was more of, we didn't really have much of a value motion. So, I didn't have business cases to look at to be like, hey, how can we measure this in the future? So we really had to think about like, what are some of the data points we have, data usage, those sort of things in the background we could use to help put together value realization, or the things we can get from our customer to help do that motion. And I think that requires obviously buy-in from the customer. So that's not always an easy
Mm,
conversation to have to get the customer to want to go through this motion. So when I was there, I historically, try to give options. I think if you can give the customer different options, they're going to land on something rather than being like, hey, we can do this for you. Would you want to do it? They're going to be like, maybe I don't want to do it. But if I give you three different ways we could do it, they're going to probably choose the path of least resistance, which at least gives us something to do and a motion to run to be able to justify that. And one of the other areas I really try to focus on for the customer's sake is really helping them understand, I want to help you. I want to elevate you in your position, because
yes.
sometimes you'll even see customers will do value realizations and you're able to showcase the great work they are doing, their teams are doing, and they get promoted. And I think if you're able to message that with your customer, you're going to get them bought in, because ultimately my
You
goal
make
is
it
to
look
make you look great. And so let's go through this motion so I can do that. And so variety of different ways to run these different activities. You could do it through data collection, value interviews. I've done impact surveys as well, like getting that out to the user base, asking specific questions, looking at who responded, if they had really good responses, like talking to them to dig deeper. So those are
good.
just some of the ideas I've run with some of the customers in the past.
It's so true with what you said earlier about helping your buyer, your champion look good. Because
Yeah.
what we found a lot of the time, your champion, it may be the very first time they've ever bought your category. They may not show it in the early days, but they could really use some buyer enablement, supporting them in coaching them. What are the variables, the data variables, or the driving variables on which to make the decision, right? Almost it is a very consultative process, right?
Yeah.
And so if look, that business, in order to make a decision, is going to need to make a business case in one way, shape, or form. It's much better if that business case is built in collaboration with the vendor so that they can use that as their decision tool as opposed to making up their own. We always say, like, there's always two sales. There's the sale that we see, the sale that we don't see.
Yep.
And that sale that we don't see is the one that we still want to be influential in.
And that's where it's, when I'm talking with any customer and we're trying to go down this route, I always tell them, like, you have your expertise in your business. Obviously, you're the expert there. And I've got expertise in our business around where we drive value. And a lot of times customers may not know exactly what your solution can drive as it relates to specific KPIs, metrics, and outcomes. And you, as the value consultant, become that bridge because maybe they're not looking at different areas that they should look at. And you can come in and help coach them and understand, how do we measure these things? Have you seen an impact across these areas? Because we normally see an impact across these areas. So like merging those two expertise to me is a way to get them more bought in, and then also unlock other areas they may not have thought of, because that's what the value consultant is there to do.
That's the problem also of starting with a demo. If you go to the demo, I think it was John McMahon that says it in his book, you're leaving it to the imagination of a buyer to connect the dots, right? So you're leaving money on the table. So at what stage in the process do you actually recommend the inevitable demo?
Yeah, so I definitely think there should be a really good understanding of, what I call the case for change. So that's like in that deep rooted discovery that an account executive will do, or even myself. Like I've done that before where, I've got the expertise to really dig deeper with a customer to really understand the case for change. And the case for change, in my opinion, is what are their current challenges? But it doesn't just stop there. It's like, what are their current challenges, but how's it impacting their people, their processes, and their business? Because there's always the size of the pain and the impact of the pain. And I think you really have to understand that foundation, because then once you're starting to start to collect all of those different details, when you get to that demo phase, you want to tie some of those challenges to what you're showing to highlight
Absolutely.
like, hey, we can do this for you. And we know you're experiencing this, and this is how that would, help you alleviate that challenge. And then the last piece I always try to recommend in that deep rooted discovery is try to at least get a good understanding of the specific outcomes they care about, because that's the last piece of the demo that you want to tie in around. Hey, maybe they're focusing on, increasing labor efficiency by reducing some different steps, and you want to showcase that and say, hey, we could save X amount of hours, and this is exactly how it would work. Like, you want to tie the challenges to that demo and also the outcomes to that demo.
I presume it's also dependent on which persona you're demoing to, right? Or you're speaking
100%.
to.
Yeah, I mean, if you got the more technical person, like that technical champion, then they're going to want to go more into the weeds. Maybe you're not talking so much about some of those challenges and things of that nature, but if you've got your champion who's more of that influencer, who's understands their business, you're going to want to touch on those things, because it's going to, light bulb will go off in their head around, okay, this is connecting the dots.
And when you engage in different sales scenarios, how do you partner with the sales rep? Is it obviously they'll bring in the lead? At what point do they engage you, and what is it that they ask you for, and what is it that you provide as a service to them?
Yeah, I think, at every, I wish there was like a one answer for that, but I know every organization, every organization is different depending on their maturity, where they are with value selling. So there have been different times where I've been brought in just based upon the nature of the sales rep and how mature they were with value selling across my different stops in the space. And so ideally, when I work with account reps, I usually try to do an initial like scoping call with them, where I wouldn't say like I hammer them, but I want to really understand what I just outlined around the foundation and the case for change. Like, how much of this stuff do we know already, and how much do we not know? Because to me, it's like, if we're able to get that, it makes my job obviously a lot easier when I have that conversation, because I like to, come into a conversation with a customer where I'm not completely blind and don't really have some assumptions around where we believe we can help them. Because the more you can lead and be, you don't have to be 100% correct with that customer in that first conversation. But if I'm 40% accurate and I know at least some of these challenges and I can start to tie those things together, then you're going to have a more fruitful conversation with your customer and really align on the specific outcomes they care about to then build out that business case. So I really try to get the reps to get that stuff.
Absolutely. And you kind of want to be at about 40% correct, no more, because you want them to correct you, right? You want them to engage and start to give you the information that's necessary to build the business case.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and I think to get some of that information, like every account rep's in a different stage of, where they can, be dangerous with value selling. But I think a natural curiosity is a really good skill set for any person to have, to really be good at doing that deep rooted discovery. And so I always try to tell reps that I've worked with, like, be curious, like just put yourself in their shoes, ask certain questions, but go layers deeper. Don't just stop at one question and be like, all right, that's it. Like, probe deeper by being curious and trying to uncover more than, maybe they're going to respond with on that first question.
It's a very natural, innate skill set. It's you can teach it, but those that have it are, they really excel.
100%. Yeah, I think that's what really helped me, is I've always been a naturally curious person. Like, I just want to learn from people and, try to understand. And so I think that helped me as I shifted out of the finance
For
world
sure.
into this space. Like I'm just naturally curious, and that's been very beneficial to
I,
me.
I mean, sales is about peeling the onion, right? Continuing
Yes.
to ask the question, the why. And I'm sure you learned that with your daughter about to join.
Yeah, I'm gonna have a lot of those why questions, aren't I?
It's good practice. It's good practice. Um, no, it's really fascinating because it is a team sport, the
Mhm.
entire value process, and how you collaborate with the sales rep. And there are two different roles that we've seen, right? The business value consultant can act more as a peer and can actually has more right to ask certain questions than the sales rep. When if you're being sold to as somebody, you may be a bit defensive, whereas if there's a consultant there, they're trying to solve your problems, it becomes an easier conversation.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there because, customers when they're talking to a salesperson, they're like, well, they're just trying to sell me, right? Like that's the
Yes,
first thought that they're like, well, so anything they really ask me, like I gotta have my guard up, like I'm not gonna, maybe give them all
exactly.
the
Don't give
information.
them
Whereas,
everything.
yeah, don't give them everything. Whereas like I always try to come in the conversation, and I'm not a salesperson by nature, so I believe like some of the questions I ask come off very relatable, and I'm able to really connect with the customer and be like, hey, this is a safe zone, this is a comfort space, and anything I try to ask, I try to, give them the reason why I'm asking it so they understand that before being like, well, why is he asking me that sort
Yeah.
of thing. And I think the value consultant is more of like, I'm not that salesperson. You're okay to give me some of these things. I'm trying to help you understand.
Yes.
And that salesperson is more of like, all right, you're going to look at me as that salesy person and you're probably not going to open up as much.
Totally. And it's a genuine conversation. It's just the expectations of the role, right?
Yeah.
It's funny. I had another one of these fireside chats with a gentleman called Dudley Nostrom, brilliant guy, also in the BBC space. And he had a unique background, which was he started on the procurement side.
Oh,
And
really?
so when he went into value practice, they'd want to bring him into every single call, because if the relatability of somebody who's been on the buyer side suddenly opens all the doors, right? Because suddenly there's somebody who's lived your condition of being the buyer. And he said it was obviously he came in to be that coach. Like, don't worry,
Yeah.
I've been in your shoes.
That's always funny because it's like when I hear it's like, oh, we're gonna have to talk to procurement. You're like, oh, great, we have to talk to procurement. But like for him, I'm sure it was like a lot easier. Like, hey, been in your shoes. I know what these discussions are
So
like. So that's really interesting.
yeah, plus when the pricing negotiation is going to happen, all that
Yep.
stuff. It's a mini superpower to have that role within the business.
Yes.
Now I can actually see why you're a baseball player, because obviously statistics, value, baseball is all about stats, right?
Sabermetrics. That's when I was younger. I collected baseball cards, flipped them over, looked at all the stats over the years, and I was very ingrained in sabermetrics, which is obviously, for those who don't know, it's a very analytical form for baseball to really analyze players. So yes, 100%. But at the time, I never knew that. Like I was just like, oh, I just like baseball. And as you get older and mature, and you start to try new things in your career, you start to understand and be more self-aware of like, oh, I have this skill set, it interests me, and how can I apply it across other areas.
Have you read the book, the Michael Lewis book, the
Is Moneyball?
Moneyball? Yeah,
Yes, love that movie. I would
yeah.
super interesting. Actually, wanted to. That was like my one goal when I was younger. It was like I want to be a baseball GM, general manager, and as I did two internships quickly at
Oh yeah.
Michigan State, and then I did the Cincinnati Reds. I got to kind of see the
Nice.
sports world, and it was a lot different than I envisioned. And so I was like, you know what? I love baseball, but let's just be a fan.
It's an interesting space. Also, you got to be really brave, right? Like to
Yeah.
to actually go through that methodology. It's a lot of risk involved. Anyway, we digress.
Yeah.
So going back to the evolution of the value in itself, how have you seen over the course of how many years now have you been in value? 5, 10?
So since 2021.
Okay. So have you seen a shift already in 4 years of expectations from buyers on the role of value, or the expectation from employers around what kind of impact value needs to bring?
Oh, 100%. I mean, like I said, when I got into this space during that time, selling was a lot easier in my opinion from what I saw. It was like you didn't necessarily have to
Totally.
have value selling a part of it. Like budgets were not as tight, like customers were more willing to spend. You didn't really have to justify as much of
More
that investment.
and more people were budget holders, so there was less
Yes.
less centralization.
Yeah. Whereas, like, as you know, like that's evolved to where we're at today, where, budgets are tighter. You have three levels of approval instead of like just one person. And so you really have to focus in on, why they need to buy us. So, like, why, what's the case for change? So I think you're seeing more of a shift on value selling and value engineering being very prominent within companies because, I mean, just even over the time frame, even 2020 and before that, like technology in itself and software companies, like you could differentiate yourself with your product and features. Like there was a bigger gap there with your competitors, and now it's like that gap is getting tighter. There's more competitors. Like just, I mean, you could look at the Magic Quadrant that Gartner does, and you see all those companies in a specific area, specific category. It's tough, and like the differentiators of the product and the features aren't as noticeable. So how are you going to
Yeah,
differentiate yourself? I think that's where value selling has become more prominent and important because it's
true.
that's going to make it, difference. The differentiator for your customers is being able to, how do we enable them to achieve their business goals and objectives? And am I able to tell a narrative that's going to, help them understand why they need to go with us?
And so looking forward into this next role, what are the big ticket items that somebody who's just started a role has to do in order to start really applying value into the value practice?
Yeah, so luckily I had an experience with, kind of getting in, fresh with my last role before coming over here to Poly AI. And the biggest thing I did is listen, talk to people within the business, understand how we go about our sales process today. Where are the
Yeah,
gaps? How are we doing value selling? How do we build business cases? Like that's the number one thing that I, think is really important is to understand where you are, because if you don't, you're going to be kind of blind. You're not going to really understand where you fit in the process and how you can impact the process and work with customers. So that's definitely number one is what I've done is just like talk to people across different, different roles like CS, product marketing, obviously the sales teams, like even just marketing in itself, like try to connect with all those people, professional services, solution consultants, all those people, understand where they play their role within the sales process and understand how we go about value selling today.
I found that product marketing specifically have a unique source of information and insight that connects directly into value.
Oh, 100%. I think in my experience, like I think it's really important to have that connection with your product marketing team because they're the ones creating the collateral, the value messaging. And I think, one of the things that's really important for any organization who's trying to adopt value selling is to have a consistent message, like across
Yes.
your use cases and what you can do. And product marketing is going to drive a lot of that stuff. So the better off you are partnering with them, the more likely you're going to have that consistent messaging.
Yeah, agree. Totally agree. Well, look, Brendan, I told you earlier, it's time for the very uncomfortable question set. The first one is, in your experience in the value space, who's been the best value consultant, value engineer you've worked with?
Yeah, so luckily I was thinking about this. So I would have to say her name's Pilar Ruda. She works over at Smartsheet. So when I was over there, we were kind of separated by region. So like East Coast, West Coast, and then EMEA. I was in the East Coast. I'm in Columbus, Ohio. So that time zone fit me. She was in Boston. So she was in the East Coast. So we partnered a lot together and
Hmm,
tremendous partner, knows a lot. But I think what she does so well is she's really good at telling the value narrative. I think that's a piece that maybe a lot of sellers or even value consultants may not focus on is that narrative
yeah,
piece. Like to me, it's like you've got the value potential, but that's icing on the cake. Can you tell the story of why they need to change and why now? Because stories unlock emotions and connections. And
exactly.
she was so good at that, at building relationships, telling that story. So I learned a ton of from her in just that area because, like I said, I was more analytical. So I could put the numbers together, crunch the numbers. Here's your value potential. But to really tell the story is more than that. And that's where I think she excelled.
That reminds me a lot of this. The whole concept in sales is that people buy with emotion and then they
Yeah.
post rationalize with fact. And so if you think about a business case, if you can drive an emotional narrative within the business case that by default delivers the rationalization of why you should buy, then it's a slam dunk. So that skill set of narrative of telling the value narrative, which is a special skill in itself, it is an innate skill. That's a very powerful thing.
100%.
All right, now on the other side, the best sales reps, account execs you ever worked with.
Yeah. So I would have to say his name is Stephen Colby. He worked over at Smartsheet as well. But I know we talked about earlier about, when AEs bring me in and sort of the things I asked them, and he was so good at discovery. And so we had a really good working relationship where, I knew when he brought me in, like I had everything I need. And so like I knew I had the
That's
information
great.
around the current state, the outcomes. And so like it made my life obviously a lot easier, which is nice. But also he didn't bring me in unless he had the right person in the room as well. I think that's also maybe tough for reps to understand. Do I have the right person to really, justify this spend, to give me the information I needed? So I mean, our success rate was
That's
pretty
good.
high working together. So
But that
really appreciated him.
somebody that understands the nuance and the relationship dynamics, that's key, right? And I'm sure from a business
Yes.
value consultant, that's very appreciated because you're a very, very thinly spread resource as it is, very dear resource. So to
Mm-hmm.
know that somebody kind of knows when to bring you in, and it won't be a waste of time must be very valuable.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, Brandon, thank you so much for making the time. Really, really enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks. Likewise, Martin. Appreciate it.